Can't see your finger. Okay, am I on now? Ace is making me laugh. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me tonight. It's Thursday night, and I am reading from the 5th book of my series. So it's a series of 10 books, and we have published 7 of them. We're in the process of putting, doing the rewrite and editing on the 8th one, and then I've got 2 more drafts. So this is called Revelry, and you'll see 2 rings on the cover. And the story of Francis and Fiona continues, and they're getting married in this story, in this book. But the secondary story is about 2 other people. Rowan, who was born and raised in Walkerville till he was about 16, and then his dad moved him up to Alaska. And Bree, who is a caterer and was a friend of Fiona's when she was down in the desert, has come up because she's going to cater their wedding. And there's been some bad news, her kitchen down south burned down and things like that. And she meets Rowan, and boy meets girl in Walkerville. So the other thing is that Rowan has been teaching history in Alaska, and he's teaching about their internment camps in World War II for the Japanese. But anyway, so that's another piece. So the piece that I'm reading tonight, this first piece is about Rowan takes Bree out to a location that's been in his family, and he's thinking about building a destination, a catering kitchen, wedding venue, meeting place. And it looks like a mess, but this is what has happened. Bree sat in the Jeep waiting for Rowan to lock up. He was trying to align the front door back on its frame without any tools. So he just propped it up and just closed the door. So now he was pulling shut the cyclone fence. She was excited and pulled out the notebook she carried everywhere. It was full of new recipe ideas, contact info for vendors, and other business queries. She was doing a rough sketch of the first floor as Rowan clambered into the Jeep. He glanced down at her, first noticing the lovely soft dark hair swirling around the base of her graceful neck, then realized that she was sketching like crazy. She glanced up at him. A wide grin on her face. She was absolutely lovely, he thought for at least the 10th time that day. He grinned. Do you know how lovely you are? Like a car headlight shutting off, her beam darkened and her neck infused with the blotchy red that rose to flush her face. Her pert nose wrinkled in disbelief while she pursed her lips. Finally, she covered her face with her hands, moaning, "Oh, Jiminy crickets." He shut off the engine and reached gently for her hands, easing them off her embarrassed face. "I'm so sorry. I was just making an observation." Shrugging her shoulders, she squeaked, "Okay, it's no biggie." Clearing her throat, she announced more clearly, "I don't mix business with pleasure." He was still holding her hands after successfully prying them off her face. Unconsciously, he rubbed the spot on her left hand between her thumb and her index finger, and she shuddered. He looked at her quizzically. "Don't do that, please," she moaned. Still rubbing the spot, he growled softly, "Don't do what?" Her body leaned into him. "My hands are very sensitive, especially right there between my thumb and my index finger." Rowan lifted her index finger to his mouth, licking it. Then he added her thumb. Then, with her thumb still in his mouth, he licked the skin between those fingers. Trying to breathe normally, Bree closed her eyes, reciting in a trance-like sing-song voice, the area of the skin between the thumb and the index finger is called the thenar web space, and the space between my thumb and my forefinger is called the pearlicue. Still licking her thenar web space, toying with her, he smiled. Good to know. Thanks for the educational note. Her voice ended in a high squeak as Rowan noisily sucked her thumb. Her slender neck arched back as she shuddered, trying to free her hand from his mouth. He let her hand go, pouncing on her neck, sucking, licking as low as he could without tearing off any buttons. She moaned and squirreled. A short time later, deeply embarrassed, she managed to rearrange herself. Retrieving a red silk scarf from her backpack, she twirled it multiple times around her neck. Taking a deep breath, she said icily, I told you I have extremely sensitive hands. Also, I do not mix business with pleasure. The last sentence was enunciated clearly and concisely, as if she were addressing a child. He cocked his head and raised his hands in all innocence, asserting, Bree, honey, way too late to make that statement. We're business partners, and we're involved personally. Crossing her legs, crossing her arms, she looked straight ahead. Just drive, please. I want to go home. Chuckling, he started the Jeep back up. I'm glad you've got sensitive hands. So this part that I'm reading next, Rowan is going to talk with his cousin Carl, who thinks that he owns this property that Bree and Rowan have just taken a look at. So it's kind of sticky. So once again, we have Rowan with his hands folded on top of the steering wheel. A passing observer might think he was praying. Hypnotized by the familiarity of the water, the cycle of breaking waves, the salt air, the pounding sounds, the misty vision, Rowan felt at peace for the first time in many years. While Walkerville wasn't on the beach, he remembered spending a lot of hours at the beach. First with family and then friends. Everyone in town went to Glass Beach. He had always felt a sense of belonging in the openness of the ocean with no walls or ceilings. He felt his world was infinite. Everything was possible until it wasn't anymore. Maybe I am saying a prayer, he mused. He had to give Carl the news about ownership of Bartholomew Landing. Carl greeted Rowan heartily at the front door, a glass of red wine in his hand. Giving his cousin a brief one-armed hug, Carl bowed, leading the way into the condo. The view was magnificent. 2 walls with floor-to-ceiling glass, creating a space that could cause your heart to pound like right now with the high tide waves crashing, or create a calm, meditative atmosphere that lent itself to reflection when the waves were gentle at low tide. The open plan of the room included a small kitchen defined by the counter. Wine? Carl offered, gesturing to his glass. Rowan nodded. Sure, great. What a fantastic view. This really is something else. Carl smiled to himself, proud that he had impressed Rowan. In the kitchen, as he poured his cousin a glass of wine, he realized that he'd been holding his breath. So how's it been being back here? Rowan was staying out at Al and Josie's in the studio that Gordon had left when he and Lorraine got married. Carl had not offered him a place to stay when Rowan called and said he was coming to town. When he contacted Al and Josie, the first thing they asked was where he was going to stay. He insisted that he use the vacant studio when he admitted he didn't have any plans. Rowan hid a smile, thinking about friends and families and the lengths some people would go to in welcoming you back. Threading his large hands behind his head, his long legs spread under the coffee table, he said, It's been great. I really missed Walkerville. Lots of changes in 20 years, huh? Carl said. His hands still linked. Rowan turned to his cousin. Yeah, being a realtor, you probably know most of those changes, right? Nodding, Carl drained his glass of wine. Indeed I do, although I have to say most of my business comes from over the hill. I gotta tell you, those techies sure have a lot of discretionary income, and they love this area. They either want to live on a secluded mountaintop or a private beach. Nervously, Carl stretched up. Hey, you want some more wine? Rowan looked up, smiling forlornly at Carl, and shook his head. No, I'm good, thanks. When Carl came back a few minutes later, Rowan was standing in front of the window, staring out into the night. Oh, what's this? Carl asked. Rowan had placed an envelope on the coffee table. Turning to face his cousin, Carl held the envelope, confusion on his face. It's addressed to you. Why are you giving it to me? Sauntering to the love seat, Rowan stood in front of it, his body turned towards Carl. Please read it. Sitting down, Rowan cleared his voice, crossed his legs, his hands holding his knees so he wouldn't juggle up and down like he did when he was nervous. The envelope wasn't sealed. Taking a gulp of wine, Carl opened it and scanned the contents quickly. He sat down. What? Then he reread it, this time more slowly. His face blanched. Involuntarily, one hand crushed the paper. What are you doing? Carl accused his cousin. With the paper still in his hand, Carl pounded on his chest. Bartholomew Landing is mine. I'm the only heir to that property. It's Bartholomew property, not Phelps property. His voice was tight, his mouth a thin line, and the veins on his neck were straining. Carl was someone who was drowning. Rowan held out his hands, pleading. I know this is a shock. It was a shock to me, too. After Dad died, I was going through his paperwork, and I found this. In the silence that followed, Carl placed the crumpled deed on the coffee table and began to smooth it with both hands, emotions playing across his face. It says that your dad was the legal owner of Bartholomew Landing since way before you left Walkerville. How can that be? Carl had abandoned his outrage, settling on his chronic sense of unfairness. Always the calmer, more sensible cousin, Rowan now found himself in that role once again. Yeah, I talked to Bendigo when I found that. He told me the full story. He'd been waiting to hear from me. In truth, what Bendigo has said was, every time I hear that ungrateful son of a bitch brag about being the owner of Bartholomew Landing, I want to tell him he's got his head up his ass. Draining his glass, Carl went to the kitchen, bringing back another bottle. He wanted to be menacing. Instead, he sounded unsteady. So what's the story? What's the lie you've been spreading about us? Rowan cleared his throat and was silent for a minute, then tackled the upheaval that Carl was surely feeling now. Looking at Carl with compassion, Rowan said, Remember when your mom died, Carl, how messed up your dad was? Sounds like he started drinking a lot, and he went up to San Pedro and hit the card rooms a bit too often. He got in pretty big trouble with some people up there. I guess he owned a bunch of money that he didn't have, and he didn't want to dip into the inheritance your mom had left you. He went to my dad and begged him for some money. He told my dad he'd sign over Bartholomew Landing to him if he'd help. Carl was hunched over the club chair, clinging to the glass that was once again empty. He was remembering how out of control his dad became after his mother's death. It was like he'd lost both parents instead of just one. Rowan continued. Dad didn't want to accept the deed, but your dad said he didn't know when he'd be able to pay you back, so he pleaded with them to take it. They both went to a Bendigo who wrote this up. Carl's face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot. Belligerently he demanded, But why didn't my dad leave me a copy of the deed? He wailed, All this time I thought Bartholomew Landing was mine. Wanting to give his cousin some time, Rowan went to the kitchen. He found a couple of glasses and filled them up with water, bringing one back to Carl. Your dad couldn't leave you the deed because Bartholomew Landing wasn't his anymore, Rowan explained gently, handing him the water. Carl looked at the glass and aimed for the plate glass window. Shards of glass shattered, liquid spraying like on the window like a Rorschach blot. Resignedly, Carl muttered, "I guess I'm glad it's only water." He got up and fumbled. Rowan silently beckoned him to sit. Acquiescing, Carl poured the last of the wine. Warren went to the kitchen area, coming back armed with paper towels and other cleaning instruments. He efficiently cleaned up the remains of the shattered glass, wiping down the window. By now, Carl had consumed more wine. As the alcohol took hold, Carl hazily watched his cousin take charge and become efficient. "I used to want to be just like you, Rowan. I wanted to be as commanding and as efficient as you are. I wanted people to look up to me the way they always looked up to you." Rowan disposed of the damage and came back to the love seat. They sat in silence for a long time. After a while, Rowan heard snoring coming from Carl. He'd passed out, his head lolling on the back of his chair, his mouth open. Rowan took a deep breath, watching his cousin. Carl was his only living relative. He had come back to be around family and with friends like Al and Josie and Francis, and now there was Bree. Finding a duvet in Carl's bedroom, he covered his cousin with it, then quietly let himself out of the condo. So we're a little bit over. I apologize. I want to thank you again for joining me tonight. I just read from Revelry. It's a book 5, and I'll be reading from it again tomorrow night. Don't forget to look below on the page here, the YouTube page, and it helps us if you click like, and if you you can find ways of how to get in touch with me if you've got some questions or feedback, and I'd love to hear from you about anything, just to say hi. And AC is archiving all of these recordings, so there's a link to that playlist down there along with everything else, and the link for tomorrow night's live stream. I will be back tomorrow, Friday night at 11. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you then.
Clear.